One thing I love about Peter's letters and also Paul's letters is they always begin with the general and then move down to the specifics. They always start with a theological principle, a basic general principle or truth of God. And in this case, Peter has been talking about how that as people who are saved, we've been newly positioned. And he talks about what our new identity is and who we are. And then he follows up by saying, because of that new identity, that new role, that new position, that new perspective, you need to really begin to have a new behavior. And that means that we own the things in our life that shouldn't be there and ask God to cleanse and forgive us. And we pursue the things that God says we need to pursue. And I think about myself sometimes how, even though I've been walking with the Lord for over 50 years, it's like I started off early on reading the Bible because that was the only thing that I knew to do. For some reason, nobody ever got around to telling me I should be reading the Bible every day, but I intuitively knew that. And I found that has become a lifelong discipline. And a discipline, even is a wrong word to use for there, because it's not something I feel that I better do this and I have to check this box every day. Rather, I look at it as being as essential as sitting down and having a cup of coffee or eating a meal, that this is necessary for the nourishment of my soul. And I feel famished, if you will. I feel a great, deep spiritual hunger in my life if I don't spend time in the Word every day. And that's what makes something like what I'm doing right now, which is, believe it or not, involves quite a bit of work on my part. It may not show, but nonetheless, it takes a lot of time to think and reflect and really organize my thoughts in a general way. And so what we find is he moves from this idea of new position, new identity, therefore it calls for a new lifestyle, a new behavior, and then he begins to specify what that is. And the very first thing he hits on is how we deal with authority in our life. You see, what sin is rebellion against God. And what is God? God is the ultimate authority. And so when people are rebelling against God, they're rejecting his authority, and that will begin to trickle down to where they will begin to reject all authority. And I understand to one degree why people do that, because there's many evil men who sit in positions of authority and abuse that authority and use it incorrectly. And to say to that person, well, you need to submit to that person, people many times assume, well, that means I just have to go along to get along and what they say I have to do. And I think that is a misreading of the text and certainly a misunderstanding of God's intentions, because one of the things he clearly said, Peter very clearly said, when the governing authority of Judea, the Sanhedrin, and the high priest commanded them, he and John, to no longer preach the gospel, to no longer tell people about Jesus. And his response was, we must obey God rather than people. And he says, we ought to obey Jesus, whom you murdered and hanged on a tree. In other words, I'm sitting there thinking about Peter just immediately said, you're telling me to break God's law just like you break God's law. Your authority is given to you so that you would help men keep God's law, yet you yourself are violating the very trust that has been given to you. So it's a correct perspective to say people who are in positions of authority in society, they are under God's authority and they have accountability. In fact, we find in the Old Testament, when God talking about the judges in the Old Testament law, he said to tell the judges that they are going to be judged, that they have a judge who is watching them and over them. And just as they are holding people accountable to society for their behavior, they too will be held accountable how they adjudicate the laws and the criminals within the society as well. And so the obligation of those who are entrusted to keep the law or enforce the law are also called to keep the law. And this has always been a historical problem, because we see since the beginning of time that men who have gotten into positions where they have that kind of authority have often used the law as a tool to accomplish their own goals, and many times their goals violate the very laws of God. So when you look at the situation that you and I are in today, where it is legal to have an abortion, but it's a violation of God's law. It's legal to be married to in a same-sex marriage relationship, but that's a violation of God's law. And so when I look at that, and when I look at people like Jack Phillips and Baronella Stutzman and others who have refused to make floral arrangements or to bake cakes for homosexual same-sex marriages, And then the law comes against them, and they begin to have to spend years. Barnell Sutzman spent 10 years and $1 million in litigation just because she wouldn't make a floral arrangement for a customer, a loyal customer, who wanted her to do it for a same-sex marriage. She stood on her conscience. There are some Christians said, oh, she should have just made them and made the flowers and not bother about it. Or Jack Phillips, whose case is now going before the Supreme Court. And I'm saying these are people who are just like Peter and John standing before the Sanhedrin saying, you can command me and order me to do something because you're of your position of authority, but in this case, I will not submit to you. So what's implied in all of this is that you're submitting to authority that's being used correctly, and you're not submitting to authority that's being used incorrectly. In fact, that one of the things he later on says is live as free men. But consider what he goes on. He says, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men. Who institutes that authority? God is the one who created governments. He created nations. So we understand the positions are created by God, but the behavior that's engaged in those positions is supposed to be subject to the God who created them. And so when those positions are being abused and used wrongly, then that doesn't mean we submit to the wrong use. And I think a lot of Christians are very fuzzy in their thinking, because as he goes on, he says he's talking about kings and as the supreme authority. And in the world in those days, the kings were the ultimate authority, or to governors who are appointed by various kings. But what are they appointed to do? He says very clearly, who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. But what is the dynamic when you have a person in a position who is supposed to punish those who do wrong, but they themselves are doing the wrong? Or are supposed to commend those who do right, but they themselves are commending those who do evil? As you read through Proverbs, you find that Solomon addresses this quite in a lot of detail. And unfortunately, many Christians today just read this passage without giving it a lot of deep thought or deep analysis, and without comparing it to the other places in Scripture where it talks about the role of government in the lives of the believer. And they simply conclude that, well, I shouldn't do anything, I shouldn't say anything. And yet, and it's even, I thought, even in the movie The Chosen, where it shows Jesus kind of counseling John the Baptist not to be so harsh in his rhetoric. And Jesus never did that. In fact, John the Baptist is beheaded. Why? Because he calls out the sinful behavior of the king. And the same thing with Jesus when it says Herod wants you to come to his palace. He says, go tell that fox I'm busy. Now, calling him a fox was a very derogatory and disrespectful terms if it wasn't true and it didn't need to be said. My whole point is that we have these examples even of Paul, who respected those who were in authority, but he refused to submit to them when they were wrong and when they were demanding that he deny the truth and do things that were evil. And I think this is really one of the things that's most troubling to me about the church today, because there is this compliance, this accommodation. In a way, it becomes a silent complicity with the evil because you don't speak out against it. So again, we're told we're supposed to respect those who are in positions of secular authority. We're supposed to obey just laws, not unjust ones. We're supposed to speak out against and resist and refuse to submit to unjust laws. And that we also are there to remind people who are in governing positions that there are legal parameters that restrict their actions, and they are commanded by God and man and by laws to only operate within those allowable boundaries. And what we see increasingly in our own country is the abuse of those boundaries. That some of these court cases that are going on around the country today, especially against political opponents of the current regime, are, if you study them and take any time to look into them, you realize that these judges and these DAs are in gross violation of the law and are abusing their authority. They're breaking the law all over the place. And yet we have Christians saying, well, we just have to respect those who are in those positions. No, I don't say that we call them ugly names, which is something I struggle with. But I say that what we do is we don't pretend that what they're doing is right. That we call wicked things wicked and evil things evil. And lawlessness we call out as being lawlessness and so forth. And that is our responsibility. That the church is designed by God to be the moral conscience of a culture. We're not supposed to be partisans. in the sense that we just choose to follow one group of political people in one direction all the time. We're Democrats, Republicans. We're not called to be that. What we're called to be is to make the choices between those who align most closely with God's righteousness, and especially with those who are aggressively speaking out and taking a stand against lawlessness. And that's something that we as Christians, I believe, have a responsibility for. And so I'll continue on a little bit more about this tomorrow, unless, of course, you don't want to hear it. You may want to skip tomorrow. But anyway, I think this is a critical moment because I think the church today is being crippled by a false theological conclusion that Christians should stay on the sidelines and not get involved in what's happening in the culture when it deals with morals and ethics and laws and policies that have tremendous, profound effect. Well, I'll jump back on this horse tomorrow. God bless you. Go in His grace.